Quite a few environmental activists have realized that slowing down is one way to live more sustainably. We'll be seeing how simplifying our lives and thinking creatively can reduce our impact on the natural world. Welcome to Eco Africa. I am Chris Alems in Lagos, Nigeria.
The modern world's culture of convenience has a very damaging effect. What if we do things differently? I am Sandra Kahumza Twinobdio, joining you from Kampala, right here in Uganda. Here is what we have coming up. An inventive use of recycled rubber sandals in Uganda. An ancient fishing method still used off the coast of Tunisia. And an artist who believes that living from the land is the key to a good life. But we begin the show in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that faces multiple environmental challenges, from the impact of mining, deforestation and poaching to water pollution. We went to Lake Kivu on the border to Rwanda to meet a young man who's trying to clean it up.
Josephat Rubenga is in a good mood, even though the job he's doing today is not exactly fun. For several years now, he's come out regularly on Lake Kivu in his pirogue boat. Together with other members of the Green Helmet team, he collects plastic waste. This is a routine for me now. Every week I set aside 4 hours of my free time to clean up Lake Kivu. I cherish this lake. I was born here and grew up here. It's part of who I am today. But it's badly clogged up with plastic. Rubbish also lines the Kawa River, which feeds into Lake Kivu here in the city of Bukavu. Environmental expert Yvlan Natampaka has long been monitoring the problem. The garbage is contaminating the water and he's concerned about the impact of the worsening pollution on marine life.
Les conséquences sont énormes et je le disais.
The consequences are enormous, not only for the human population, but also for the aquatic population. This should be a nursery for fish and their young. They should come here to reproduce. But unfortunately, it's a place that's already polluted, and so these fish are forced to flee the area. The Democratic Republic of Congo has no functioning waste collection system. Every day, thousands of tons of plastic waste end up in illegal landfills or strewn about the place. The situation is equally catastrophic in many parts of the country. Locals have recently noticed a significant decline in Zambaza, a sardine that's native to Lake Kivu. Populations will likely continue to dwindle unless the lake is cleaned up. This would have far-reaching consequences for those who live from fishing here. This makes the work of the Green Helmet activists all the more important. Dozens of garbage collectors comb the city for plastic bottles and take them to a collection point where a member of the team pays them accordingly to the amount they've gathered. A bag of garbage fetches the equivalent of just under €1. This work helps me a lot, because when I collect the bottles, I help my family. The bottles are then sorted by brand. The aim is to persuade the companies that make them to support the initiative. The plastic that's collected is then used as construction material. This floating platform, produced from bottles, was made by the young activists. The plan is to build a much larger project based on their model. Tilatopia will be an artificial island over 1,200 square meters in size and set in the middle of the lake. This is where we are going to set up the initiative called Tilatopia, which will be a hotel complex. It will have 6 guest rooms and a multi-purpose hall where conferences can be held to raise awareness of the problem of plastic pollution.
de la pollution, principalement la pollution plastique.
But in order to make that happen, they need to collect 2.5 million plastic bottles. That'll be a lot of work, but the Green Helmet Group is nothing if not determined.
Fishing takes patience and skill, and especially when it is done using palm leaves. It might not sound as efficient as using nets, but it is an ancient fishing method that is still practiced in Tunisia's Kekana Islands.
Exactly, Sandra. Where there is no shortage of palm trees, it's called shafia fishing, and it's especially environmentally friendly. Our reporter went there to find out how this amazing tradition works and if it can survive in today's world.
The sea is Ala Kabour's second home. Today he's once again heading out to go fishing, using an age-old technique found only here on the Kekena Islands off Tunisia's east coast. It's called shafia and involves catching fish with the help of palm fronds.
I've always worked at sea. When I was a kid, I went fishing with my dad. And when I finished my studies and returned home, I automatically went back to fishing.
Each shafia is arranged as a triangular barrier. The palm fronds can be seen in the shallow waters all around the archipelago. The fishing technique relies on tidal currents to drive the fish into the traps. Unlike fishing trawlers, the shafia don't harm the marine environment. Instead, they preserve biodiversity.
The problem with the drag nets is that they don't allow anything to escape. With the palm branches, fish find holes to swim through.
Kibour's friend, Amin Guinides, is also on board. He's not a fisherman but an artist and is fascinated by this ancient fishing technique. Traditionally, it involves the use of date palm branches. For Guinides, they too are part of the Kekena Islands' cultural heritage. In his studio, he creates various products to sell, using different parts of the palm.
The basis of the Kekenian shafia is a cage that inspired me to create decorative objects for indoors and outdoors. I tried to retain the original look.
He sees himself as an ambassador for shafia. In 2020, UNESCO declared it part of humanity's intangible cultural heritage. It's also linked to age-old traditions and cultural practices.
I was using this method as a basis for my project without really knowing how it works. Once I learned more, I fell in love with the sea.
But times have changed. Some now use plastic traps as they're cheaper. Others have abandoned the practice altogether as it's time-consuming. And industrial fishing has decimated fish stocks, so the haul in the shafia has also plummeted. But some fishermen are actively campaigning to preserve the tradition, especially because it works in harmony with nature.
The palm branches give fish somewhere to hide and live. It's an ecological method that preserves and respects the environment.
This fisherman believes shafia will continue to stand the test of time, as the fish caught this way are far superior to the catch from industrial fishing.
The fish are brought to shore alive. That's why they're considered to be of better quality than those caught by other means.
And high-quality fish is an important source of income for the archipelago and an added draw for tourists who visit the islands. But for Ala Kabour, shafia fishing is more than a trade. It's part of Kekena's unique cultural identity that's now at risk of disappearing.
In the past, all our ancestors had a shafia. They would build it up over the summer months. But today, having a shafia requires significant financial capital.
Money that many are unable or unwilling to invest. And so shafia fishing continues to dwindle, even though it's so sustainable.
From traditional fishing to modern agriculture, all over the world farmers are angry and have been taken to the streets to protest What are the reasons for their anger? And what exactly do they want? And what unites them? And what does the climate have to do with it? Let's start our investigation in Europe.
Farmers have been out protesting seemingly non-stop all over Europe, from Portugal to Latvia to Romania to France. There are so many specific EU rules, and in the end we can no longer produce at low prices. We want things to change because this business is our passion. In France and Germany, the demos have focused on the reduction of diesel subsidies. This agricultural diesel refund of 1 cent per litre meant a reimbursement of €25,000 for us. If we lose the subsidies now, I really don't know how we'll make ends meet. Farmers in Greece are still reeling from floods in 2023 and want faster compensation for damage from natural disasters. In Hungary and Poland, farmers were angry about imports of cheap grain from Ukraine. After Russia's invasion, the EU waived tariffs on Ukrainian grain and produce as a measure of support. The government won't talk to us, so we came to Warsaw to show the power of Polish farmers. Be it diesel subsidies, flood damages or grain imports, farmers feel abandoned by their governments. And from a financial perspective, this might well be true.
It's just a fact that over time, agriculture tends to shrink relative to other sectors of the economy.
Stefan von Kramont-Hauberdel is an agricultural policy economist and a consultant to the World Bank and several national governments.
And this is true almost everywhere in the world. I can't think of any real exceptions.
European farms are dying out, decreasing by roughly a third since 2005. Still, 8.7 million people worked in European agriculture in 2020, and that doesn't include seasonal workers. Farmers worldwide face higher rates of mental health problems compared to the general public. In Europe and the US, the farming population has shown elevated suicide rates.
Being a farmer is not only having the job as a farmer, but really giving all in.
Agricultural economist Marie von Meyerhofer researches the social side of sustainable food systems.
It's a way of life, and that's why it's so emotional.
Above all, small farmers are struggling as they lose relevance in our economic system, which in many ways is stacked against them.
The wealth across the value chain is not distributed in a fairly manner.
Ivan Ivanov works at a federation that advocates for European farmers and farm workers.
Retailers and big food manufacturers are getting like the biggest share of the value which is produced in the agri-food sector, and farmers and farm workers, which are like in the bottom of this value chain.
Giant supermarket chains have massive negotiating power over prices. A European Commission survey found that almost all EU food chain suppliers reported experiencing at least one form of unfair trade practice. These miserable prices have our backs to the wall. Corporations care about nothing and only about prices. Then there are international trade deals like the proposed EU-Mercosur agreement with Latin American countries. Farmers say they increase cheap agricultural imports produced at far lower standards. We're allowing food in that's not made the way we do it here. The price negotiations with supermarkets and manufacturers are not going well. We're asking for all this to be put on the table and for swift, concrete responses. The target for that frustration is usually the EU Commission in Brussels, which controls another thing farmers resent, the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP for short. The system was launched in 1962 to deal with post-war food scarcity in Europe. Almost 3/4 of the CAP budget goes to direct payments for farmers, but payments are calculated based solely on how big the farm is. This means the policy rewards industrial farms, which tend to be monoculture corporations. For example, one of Europe's biggest arable farms is Agricost, a Romanian cereal producer. UAE investors bought it for reportedly between 200 to 300 million euros, but the farm gets over 10 million annually in EU subsidies. Romania exports a large majority of its grain, meaning the yield from these massive farms is not benefiting the local economy. And most European farms are small, ageing family farms with less than 5 hectares of land. The younger generation is afraid. Many are asking, will we even get a job later on if the law is implemented as planned? And if all that weren't complex enough already, enter climate goals. Europe has lofty plans to become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. Agriculture is responsible for more than 10% of total EU greenhouse gas emissions.
Relative to the size or the overall economic importance of the sector, it produces disproportionately a large share of greenhouse gases.
The European Commission's responded by launching its own Green Deal policies to make food systems more environmentally sustainable.
We can afford kind of to think about the extra issues like environmental protection, like biodiversity, like ethical issues.
Many of the European farmers' protests have targeted EU Green Deal policies such as phasing out diesel subsidies, reducing fertiliser and pesticide use, and setting aside land for biodiversity. They say the rules don't compensate them for the income loss, so they're taking too big a share of the burden.
The problem with the policy is that it is a bit schizophrenic. If it's meant to be income support, then you think, you should be targeting smaller farms with low income more and not the big farms.
But if the policy is to reduce farming's climate impact,
well then a big farm should be getting more payments because a big farm is affecting in the environment on a much larger number of hectares.
The protests have had some effect. France dropped its fuel subsidy cut and the EU scrapped a plan to reduce pesticides. And EU trade support for Ukraine now contains a measure to prevent too many Ukrainian products being sold in EU states. But it would take more to help farmers and address climate change in the long term, such as limiting EU legislation to the environmental aspects of agriculture, away from farming subsidies.
Income support is in the European Union a national policy priority. The social policies are national priorities that shouldn't be coming from Brussels.
In that case, each member state would support its own farmers. It would have more flexibility in shaping subsidies, which could support smaller farms and create incentives and financial support for more ecological practices. Consumers would also have to change their habits. In the EU, farming's environmental cost isn't fully included in food pricing. Changing that would shift the pressure on low-income households.
Policymakers are going to have to find ways of buffering that and distributing the load, but the load has to increase.
Meanwhile, smaller farmers are hoping for a bigger seat at the table. We're people who work with the earth, with nature. That's our passion. The people who manage this sit in offices. Unfortunately, they don't even know what nature is.
We have a problem in whose interests are represented. Actors who are more or less have interest in keeping more or less the status quo, and they are also quite influential ones, who are very much shaping all the political agenda.
If we want farmers to be able to provide our food sustainably, it seems that the current system that favours the biggest players will have to be fundamentally reformed.
In our next report, we head to France to meet a farmer who is perfectly happy. He only uses old-fashioned methods that most farmers these days do not have time for. He does not even have a tractor, but he believes in respecting the environment. He lives from the land and tries completely self-sufficient.
Meet Samuel Lewis, who has never attended school or taken up a job. He lives in Brittany, getting by with almost no money, but a will to care for the environment.
Basically, all we need is provided for us by the soil. And if we know how to farm it, we can live in a beautiful environment.
The 37-year-old uses traditional tools to tend to the 3 hectares plot. By using old-fashioned ways, he avoids using inorganic farm inputs and equipment which harm the biosphere. Samuel gets his various food supplies from the farm: vegetables, grains, and even bread. By rejecting consumerism, he prefers cultivating his garden and being fully sustained by it. That's what interests me, spending less time working for money, because for me it seems like a cycle of poverty and destruction of my environment. And I want to have time to look after living things. Environmental sustainability is key to Samuel, but for him it's even more important to share his knowledge with others. He publishes and sells books that teach people how to take care of the environment. Samuel is living his dream, a simple life and living in harmony with nature.
My mission is to try and redress the balance, and just to tell people, particularly younger people, you don't necessarily have to destroy your environment.
An interesting character, in a way, is as much an artist as a farmer. Our next report features another crossover between arts and the environment. It takes us to Uganda. Over now to Sandra.
Thank you, Chris. Now, here in Kampala, only 5% of garbage is recycled, and the streets are quite badly littered. But to artist and designer Allen Nabukenya, trash is a resource. She's even found to have a creative use for rubber sandals that people have thrown out.
Allen Nabukenya is combining her passion for art with care for her environment. Collecting discarded flip-flops is the first step to a process she has invented to turn plastic pollution into something useful. Uganda, like many places around the world, is littered with hundreds of thousands of plastic flip-flops. This one, this farmer pulls out of his field, is about to be given a new creative purpose.
To my surprise, this girl collects them, and we see her getting out beautiful things.
Nabukenya turns the flip-flops into paint, which she uses to make works of art and other objects. For the artist, it's a way of coping with the mess people have been making of the world around them.
Besides the saving of the environment, we are promoting the culture of recycling in our country. So this could be something very interesting if other artists can actually come and try it out.
At her flip-flop collection point, Nabukenya begins to reclaim the original bright colors that enticed people to buy the footwear in the first place. Scrubbing the flip-flops by hand and leaving them in the sun to dry is a laborious job, but is crucial for her project. Transforming them into art materials, back in the studio, she uses a belt sanding machine to reduce the footwear to a fine dust, which she collects and mixes with a binder to make paint. With such a variety of discarded flip-flops, Nabukenya has been able to create a palette of bold colors with which she expresses herself. She has also brought in other materials into her artworks, such as stripes of discarded vehicle tires. Nabukenya is making a name for herself in the Kampala art world and internationally with the art she makes from flip-flops or slippers as they're known locally.
Her technique is so unique, and the reason as to why I love it because of the texture, and another thing is she conserves the environment by using slippers and tires. Yeah, instead of burning and throwing them away, but rather she turns them into life.
Nabukenya hopes that her art can raise awareness of our effects on nature and change people's attitudes towards products that we no longer have a use for.
I'm here to save nature. Our people have mismanaged waste a lot, and we are here to tell them that this can be twisted around, and after the functionality that they actually know about, they can maybe do something else, and this is an ending life.
Besides her paintings, Allen Nabukenya also designs and adorns fashion items. The Ugandan artist is looking at more use for her recycled paint. With so many flip-flops still to be removed from the environment, she says she could produce house paint as well.
A brilliant idea, making things by hand and making things that last. We should all be doing more of that. We hope you feel as inspired as we are by our report this week. I am Chris Alems in Nigeria.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to head to our Eco Africa online platforms for more stories and drop us a line at eco@dw.com. I am Sandra Kahomza Twinobdio signing off from Kampala right here in Uganda.